Welcome, dear followers. How are you? Imagine, if you will, the small village of Oakhaven, nestled against the looming deep green mystery of the Blackwood Forest. It is late afternoon, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence is so profound it seems to press against the ears. Our story begins with a woman named Elara, whose small cottage stood at the very edge of the manicured village green, where the neat rows of fences gave way to the ancient, untamed wilderness. Elara was bent over her window box, tending to her lavender, the only sound the soft rustle of her dress against the stone wall. The forest, a silent, sprawling backdrop to her life, had always felt impenetrable, a place of shadow and deep-rooted quiet. But on this particular evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long skeletal fingers of shade across her lawn, the silence was suddenly, subtly broken. It was not a sound of the wind or of the creatures of the woods. It was a sound that was profoundly, unmistakably human. A faint melody, soft as a breath, yet clear enough to carry over the natural murmur of the woods. It was played on an instrument she could not place, a wooden flute, perhaps, or a simple reed pipe. The tune was haunting, a rise and fall of notes that spoke of deep, quiet sorrow, but also of a strange, enduring beauty. She straightened up slowly, her hands still stained with soil, and turned her head toward the massive, dark wall of trees that marked the edge of the world she knew. The melody was so fragile, so unexpected, that it felt less like music and more like a voice carried on the wind, a whisper from a secret place. It played for only a minute or two before dissolving completely back into the forest's silence. Elara stood motionless, listening to the sudden, profound quiet that followed. Who would be playing music so deep within the forest, a place the villagers avoided after dark? She walked to the stout wooden fence that marked her property line, placing her palm on the rough timber. She had always believed the forest was empty of people, yet the music was undeniably real. A small shiver traced its way down her spine, a mixture of apprehension and an insistent, budding curiosity. She told herself it was likely a traveler passing through on an old, forgotten path. But the quality of the music, so deliberate, so near, and yet so carefully hidden, suggested something far more intentional. Was it a signal, or merely the idle pastime of a solitary soul? She waited until the last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the forest into a velvety darkness that swallowed all sound. Yet the lingering echo of that beautiful, sorrowful melody remained fixed in her mind. It was a memorable emotional moment that fractured the calm of her predictable life. What was the origin of that song? But was that really music or something else entirely? If you enjoyed the story, please like and share. Now, try to let your imagination run wild.
The soft, sorrowful melody returned the following evening, and the evening after that, becoming an insistent, if ephemeral rhythm in Elara's life. It was a strange or unexpected detail that defied the logic of the placid village. The tune never lasted long, perhaps a dozen notes at most, but it was enough to draw her gaze repeatedly toward the dark, inviting gateway of the forest. On the third day, the need to understand the source of the sound overcame her apprehension. She dressed in sturdy clothes, tied her hair back, and taking a small satchel, slipped through her back gate just as the morning mist was lifting. She told herself she was merely foraging for late-season berries, but her true purpose lay deeper, amongst the towering, silent pines. She entered the Blackwood Forest, following the general direction from which the music seemed to drift. The ground beneath the ancient canopy was soft with pine needles, and the air was cooler, quieter than the air of the village. For a long time she found nothing but the natural, beautiful monotony of the woods. Moss-covered stones, the sound of her own breathing, and the distant, repetitive call of a wood thrush. She walked deeper than she ever had before, perhaps for an hour, before a flash of something lighter against the dark bark of an oak caught her eye. It was small, no bigger than her hand, nestled in the crotch of a low-hanging branch that had been snapped by a storm some time ago. She approached it slowly, her heart beginning to beat a rapid, anxious rhythm against her ribs. It was a carving. Not a piece of natural wood, but something meticulously fashioned by human hands. It was the figure of a small bird, perhaps a wren or a finch, rendered with such exquisite detail that the tiny feathers seemed capable of catching the wind. The wood was a pale, polished beech, smooth and cool to the touch. This was not a carelessly whittled toy. It was the work of a true artisan, someone who possessed a profound patience and respect for the natural world. The act of finding it, placed so intentionally yet so subtly, sent a wave of genuine shock through her. The music had been an auditory clue, but this was a tangible, undeniable sign of presence. This was the memorable emotional moment. The realization that the source of the mystery was not an imaginary traveler, but a person with skill, residing, or at least spending significant time, right here in the heart of the secluded woods. She turned the tiny wooden bird over and over in her palm, tracing the minute lines of the beak and the wing. Why would someone leave such a beautiful object in the middle of a place where no one ever walked? Was it a gift, a signpost, or merely something forgotten? It raised a profound, mysterious question. If the person was hiding, why create something so beautiful and then abandon it where it could easily be found? She looked up, scanning the density of the surrounding trees, searching for any break in the foliage, any faint impression on the forest floor, any other indication of human passage. The mystery of the forest dweller, the maker of the music and the carver of the bird, had just become acutely real. She placed the wooden bird carefully into her satchel, a precious piece of evidence, and continued her quiet exploration, drawn onward by a force she could no longer deny.
Clutching the small, smooth carving in her satchel, Elara continued her search, moving with a heightened sense of alertness. She no longer felt like a mere forager, she was a seeker, pulled by an unseen tether toward the source of the mystery. After another hour of walking through the quiet, unbroken woods, the character of the forest began to change. The ground sloped gently downward, and she began to hear a sound that was less an echo and more a steady, rhythmic presence, the rush of moving water. Following the sound, she soon emerged into a small clearing, hidden from the main tracks by a thicket of gorse and overgrown hazel. Before her stood the decaying structure of the abandoned mill, a sight the villagers spoke of in hushed tones, claiming it had been derelict for generations. It stood beside a stream that whispered over stones, the water clear and swift. The old mill building was listing, its water wheel long since collapsed, its timbers silvered and softened by years of rain and neglect. Yet this was the moment of strange or unexpected detail. Despite the general air of decay, there were subtle, almost imperceptible signs of recent tending. A rough pathway had been recently cleared of the worst of the brambles leading up to the mill's single wooden door. A few broken roof slates had been replaced with fresh planks, albeit crudely. But the most unsettling and significant discovery was inside. Pushing the creaking door open, Elara stepped into the main room, where the great grinding stones lay silent and dust-covered. In the corner, near a crude bench fashioned from a fallen log, stood an old stone hearth, its chimney rising through the ruined roof. She approached it tentatively. The stone was not cold. In fact, it radiated a faint residual warmth, the unmistakable sign of a fire extinguished only a few hours before. This was a profound realization, a memorable emotional moment that eclipsed the finding of the bird. Someone was not just visiting this ruin, someone was living here. The person who made the music and the carving was finding shelter in this forgotten place. The realization filled her with a rush of conflicting feelings, a deep surge of sympathy for the solitary life this person must be leading, and a sharp spike of apprehension. What kind of person chose such isolation? Why hide so deeply when the village was only a short walk away? She moved slowly, examining the sparse evidence. On the bench, she noticed a scattering of fine wood shadings, the remnants of a recent carving project. Beside them lay a simple, leather-bound book, tucked beneath a worn woolen blanket. She resisted the urge to open the book, respecting the person's evident need for privacy. Instead, she knelt by the hearth, placing her hand on the still warm stones. It felt like touching the heart of the mystery. The smoke had dissipated, but the scent of wood smoke, pine, and something faintly herbal, perhaps tea, clung to the air. She felt an overwhelming sense of proximity, as if the forest dweller had only just slipped away. Why would they leave the hearth warm? Was it a calculated risk, or had they been surprised? The sheer fact of their prolonged, hidden existence raised a crucial, mysterious question. But had they been watching her approach through the trees, or were they simply nearby, foraging? She needed to return quickly now, armed with the knowledge that the anonymous voice of the forest was in fact a solitary soul living just beyond the edge of her world.
Elara retreated from the mill, her heart still thrumming with the excitement of discovery. She took great care to leave no sign of her presence, pulling the mill door gently shut and retracing her steps through the gorse. She knew she could not simply leave the matter there. The image of that small, still warm hearth and the solitary existence it implied had lodged deep in her conscience. She decided to return, but this time to watch, to observe from a distance, driven by a deep human need for connection, even if it was unacknowledged. She returned late the next morning, approaching the clearing with the meticulous stealth of a predator, though her intentions were purely benign. She settled behind a thick curtain of ferns on a small rise overlooking the mill, where she had a clear, albeit partially obscured view of the entrance and the stream. She waited for what felt like an eternity, the forest sounds, the scolding of a jay, the constant shush of the stream, acting as a calming, natural rhythm. The sun climbed higher, warming the forest floor, and still there was nothing but silence from the old structure. Just as she considered abandoning her vigil, convinced that the dweller was simply elsewhere for the day, it happened. The wooden door of the mill cracked open, and a figure emerged. It was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, tall and slender, dressed in simple, patched woolen trousers and a faded shirt. His hair was long, the color of dark earth, and pulled back loosely from a face that, even from this distance, conveyed a profound sense of weary gentleness. He carried a rough-hewn wooden bowl and walked silently to the stream to fill it with water. The memorable emotional moment for Elara was the sheer force of seeing him, a real person, the creator of the exquisite bird and the haunting melody after days of chasing shadows and signs. There was a quiet dignity in his movements, a self-contained grace that spoke of a deep familiarity with his surroundings. He knelt by the water, the sunlight catching a brief reflection off the surface of the stream, and as he drank, he looked up, not directly at Elara, but toward the dense trees bordering the other side of the clearing. It was a fleeting but powerful gaze, intense and shadowed, like a person perpetually expecting to be alone, yet never entirely surprised by the world around them. Then, in an action that was the strange or unexpected detail, he stood up abruptly, without having made any sudden noise or motion, and stared for a beat directly toward Elara's hiding spot. He did not see her, but he seemed to sense something. It was an unnerving moment of profound vulnerability and sudden alarm. He did not hesitate. Without taking his eyes from the trees, he moved with the swiftness of a forest creature, slipping back through the mill door, which closed with a soft, final thud. Elara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had caught a single, fleeting glimpse of the forest dweller, a glimpse that lasted only a few seconds, and then he had vanished, leaving only the silence and the whispering stream. She was left with a powerful, burning curiosity and a new, more tangible question about his secrecy. But had he genuinely sensed her presence, or was his sudden retreat merely a deep-seated habit of solitude? She gathered her things, knowing that direct confrontation was not the answer. She needed to understand more about his need for isolation before attempting any form of contact.
The encounter with the young man, however brief, solidified Elara's resolve. He was real, he was gentle, and he was deliberately hidden. She understood that invading his space by going directly into the mill was not the path forward. Instead, she decided to seek out the faint impressions he left on the edges of his world. Returning to the area near the mill the following day, she avoided the clearing itself and began to meticulously trace the perimeter, searching for a path that led away from the stream, perhaps toward a quieter, more sheltered part of the woods. Her patience was rewarded near a cluster of enormous granite boulders, partially covered in ivy. Here the ground was slightly disturbed, and the keen eye of a tracker noticed what a casual passerby would miss: a barely visible trail, a depression in the moss and pine needles that suggested frequent, careful passage. Following this hidden path, which was so subtle it seemed to melt back into the forest with every step she took, she was led about a quarter of a mile further into the dense, silent interior. The path culminated in a small, unbelievably well-concealed alcove, formed by a natural overhang of rock and several cleverly placed, large pieces of fallen bark. This was not the mill. This was his true, private shelter. It was a small, dry, and intensely private space. The strange or unexpected detail she observed here was the sheer, meticulous order of the place. Everything was arranged with an almost painful care. A stack of dry firewood, a small pile of foraged herbs, and a smooth, flat stone used as a table. The atmosphere spoke not of desperation, but of deliberate, chosen simplicity. It was in this alcove, tucked beneath the small stone table, that she made her most significant discovery yet. It was the journal she had glimpsed at the mill, forgotten here, or perhaps intentionally left behind. She recognized the worn leather cover instantly. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, feeling the weight of its secrets. The pages were warped and stiff from exposure to moisture, a poignant reminder of the harshness of his chosen life. This was the memorable emotional moment, holding the key to his silence. She gently opened the book. The handwriting was neat, slightly hurried, and often faded. Many entries were simply sketches of birds, trees, and the complex patterns of lichen on stone, revealing the eye of an artist. But some contained words, written in a beautiful, flowing hand, yet frustratingly cryptic.
One entry, dated roughly 2 years prior, stood out despite being water damaged. It read, "The noise of the town is too much. They look at me, and I see only the reflection of her sadness in their eyes. The wood speaks a language they cannot understand. The silence is necessary for the carving to breathe." The journal did not reveal his name or the exact nature of the sadness, but it confirmed a withdrawal, a purposeful retreat from the community born of deep, unresolved pain. This provided the crucial, mysterious question: but was the journal left here by accident, or did he intentionally allow a sympathetic soul to find it and begin to understand his reasons? Elara carefully replaced the journal exactly where she found it, knowing she now held the first threads of the truth about the talented, lost soul in the Blackwood Forest.
Elara did not immediately return to the hidden alcove. She allowed a day to pass, processing the fragments she had gleaned from the damp, forgotten journal. The words, "They look at me, and I see only the reflection of her sadness in their eyes," resonated deeply, confirming that the young man's retreat was a consequence of a profound grief and a difficulty confronting the pity or scrutiny of others. He was an artisan, driven by a need to channel his anguish into the quiet perfection of wood. She understood now that his seclusion was not born of malice or fear, but of an overwhelming internal pain. The following morning, Elara returned to the mill clearing, not to watch, but to leave something. She carried a basket containing a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from her oven, a small wedge of aged cheese, and a clean, folded wool blanket, a silent offering that spoke only of care and acknowledgement. She placed the basket carefully on the large, flat stone just outside the mill door, weighting the blanket with a smooth river stone so the wind could not carry it away. This silent gesture was the memorable emotional moment, an act of compassion, bridging the gap between her world and his. She left immediately, careful not to look back, wanting the gift to feel like a whisper rather than a shout. That afternoon she sat by her window, outwardly occupied with her embroidery, but inwardly preoccupied with the fate of the basket. As dusk began to settle and the light in the forest grew thin and indigo, she saw him. This was the strange or unexpected detail. The young man, whom she now thought of as the Lost Artisan, was standing silently at her fence line. He was only there for a few seconds, shrouded by the deepening shadows of the Blackwood. He was not carrying the basket, but he was holding something small and white in his hands. He did not step onto her lawn. He simply stood there, his figure a study in stillness, gazing at the cottage window, directly at where she sat. His sudden, unannounced presence at the boundary of her world sent a sharp jolt through her, a mixture of validation and slight fear. He had found the provisions, and he had sought her out, at least visually. It confirmed that he was aware of her movements and her kindness. But why stand there in the shadows, silent, instead of approaching? What prevented him from simply saying a single word of thanks? She sat perfectly still, not wanting to frighten him away, observing the quiet intensity of his gaze. It was a look of deep, complicated gratitude mixed with the entrenched habit of avoidance. He raised a small white object briefly, almost as a salute, before turning and dissolving back into the darkness of the trees, leaving no trace behind but the renewed sense of profound mystery. He had risked the exposure of the village edge to acknowledge her, yet he maintained his silence. The journal had revealed a man crippled by grief, but this interaction revealed a person struggling with the courage to connect. This brought a significant, mysterious question. But why did he choose to show himself to her outside her home, instead of simply leaving a note at the mill? His actions felt less like a retreat and more like a tentative step toward communication.
The morning after the young man, the Lost Artisan, had appeared at her fence line, Elara woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She had seen his acknowledgement, a silent communication across the divide.
She returned to the mill clearing, bringing only a small package of dried apples and a small bottle of fresh milk. She found the basket from the day before placed neatly beside the flat stone, empty of the bread and cheese, the wool blanket now gone. This small detail, the returning of the container, was a testament to his respectful nature. But resting precisely in the center of the clean, flat stone was his response, the unexpected gift she had seen him holding the previous night. It was a rose, carved entirely from a pale, creamy piece of hardwood. It was utterly flawless. The delicate, unfurling layers of petals were so thin they seemed almost translucent, capturing the light and throwing back soft shadows. The stem, meticulously detailed, even featured tiny, blunt thorns. It was a masterpiece of patient, meticulous effort, a small sculpture that conveyed a depth of feeling beyond words. This was the memorable emotional moment. The sheer, overwhelming beauty of the gift spoke volumes about the artisan's gratitude and his capacity for love and creation, even in the midst of his self-imposed isolation. Elara picked it up, its polished smoothness cool against her fingertips, and felt a rush of tears sting her eyes. This rose, crafted in the shadows of the Blackwood, was more eloquent than any verbal exchange could have been. It was the strange or unexpected detail that the rose was not merely a rose, but that the very center of the bloom, the tight cluster of inner petals, had been carved to resemble the soft curl of an ear, or perhaps the wing of a sleeping bird, a subtle, deeply private signature woven into the artistry. It was a detail only a person intimately familiar with the patterns of nature and the minute possibilities of wood could conceive. It seemed to whisper, "I see the hidden beauty in things, and I offer it to you." Elara carried the rose back to the village, hiding it securely in her satchel, and placed it on her mantelpiece, where its silent beauty acted as a powerful focus for her thoughts. The gift had moved their silent conversation into a new, more intimate space. He had accepted her kindness and reciprocated with the most valuable thing he possessed, his art. She realized their connection was not a temporary curiosity, but a sustained exchange. The young man, driven by his sorrow, was still reaching out, using his creations as a bridge. His mastery over the wood suggested a life that prior to his retreat was likely filled with admiration and demand for his craft. Why would such a talent bury himself entirely? The question of his identity and his specific unspoken grief pressed on her mind. But was this magnificent gift intended as a thank you, or was it a final gesture meant to gently encourage her to stop looking for him? The answer, she knew, lay in her next action. She would not stop. She would attempt to meet him.
Armed with the delicate wooden rose and a profound conviction that the time for observation had passed, Elara prepared for her next visit. She knew a direct, unannounced approach would likely send the young man, Silas, as she had decided to call him in her mind, assigning a name to the shadow, fleeing deeper into the forest. Instead, she decided to return to the mill, the place of secondary shelter, and wait. It was a calculated risk, betting on his habit of returning to the hearth. She arrived late in the afternoon, just as the day was beginning its gentle fade, bringing with her only a small, simple pot of herbal tea and 2 clean earthenware mugs. She pushed the mill door open and stepped inside, the warm scent of residual wood smoke welcoming her. She did not light a new fire. She simply sat on the rough-hewn bench near the cold hearth, poured herself a mug of tea, and waited. The air was thick with the forest silence, broken only by the steady, soothing sound of the stream running outside. This waiting was a memorable, emotional moment of quiet bravery, a deliberate act of vulnerability.
She was placing her trust entirely in the gentle nature she had glimpsed in his art and his fleeting presence. She waited for a very long time. The shadows stretched and deepened, and the mill's interior became a study in monochrome. Just as the darkness seemed absolute, and Elara was beginning to resign herself to a failed vigil, the door creaked open with the slightest of sounds. The young man stood there, silhouetted against the indigo light of the clearing. He froze immediately, his body taut with the instinct of flight, his eyes wide and dark in the gloom. He was clearly startled, having expected only the usual empty silence. Elara did not move. She did not stand up. She did not speak, and she did not attempt a welcoming smile, knowing any sudden action would break the fragile moment. She simply held out the second mug of tea toward the spot of light where he stood, her hand steady and open. This was the start of the silent conversation. He stood there for perhaps a full minute, an eternity in that tense, quiet space, his breath barely audible. She saw the profound conflict in his posture, the deep-seated desire to disappear instantly, battling with the irresistible pull of simple human acknowledgement. It was the strange or unexpected detail that he did not run. Slowly, tentatively, he closed the door behind him and stepped further into the room. He moved with the caution of a wild animal, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for any sign of judgment or pity. He crossed the room, stopping a few feet from the hearth, not taking the mug. They simply looked at each other in the dim light. In his eyes, Elara read the complex map of his suffering, the grief, the self-reproach, the deep exhaustion of perpetual solitude. In her eyes, he found only a quiet, steady acceptance. She waited, allowing the silence to do the heavy work of communication. Finally, after another long pause, he took one more hesitant step, and she heard the subtle rustle of cloth as he accepted the mug from her hand. His fingers, calloused from carving, but possessing the delicacy of an artist, brushed against hers. It was a powerful moment of shared understanding, unspoken, yet deeply felt. He sank onto the floor, his back against the cool stones of the hearth, and brought the warm mug to his lips. Elara knew then that the siege of his solitude had been broken, but was his acceptance of the mug a sign of trust, or merely a surrender to his loneliness? The answer would only come when he chose to speak.
The silence in the mill was a tangible thing, heavy yet peaceful. The young man, Silas, as Elara now felt certain he must be, sipped the tea, his eyes never leaving her face, not with suspicion, but with a deep, careful scrutiny. Elara held her peace, understanding that the first word must come from him, a choice made from within the fortified walls of his own solitude. The memorable emotional moment arrived not with a thunderclap, but with a barely audible sigh, a release of breath that seemed to carry years of pent-up emotion. He spoke, and his voice was low, rough from disuse, yet possessing a resonant quality that betrayed the former musician, the creator of the haunting forest melody. His first words were profoundly simple. "Thank you." He set the mug down on the dirt floor. "My name," he continued, after a long pause, his gaze falling to his hands, "is Silas. I have been in these woods for 2 years. I saw you when you left the bread." Elara offered a gentle nod, not pressing him, merely acknowledging his honesty. The ice had been broken, and the words, once started, began to flow, albeit slowly and with great effort, like water finding its way through a long disused channel. Silas explained that he had been the most sought-after woodcarver in a distant town, known for his intricate work. His wife, Lyra, had been a weaver, famous for the vibrant complexity of her tapestries.
They lived a life rich in creation and quiet contentment. Then came the tragedy, the cause of his long retreat. Lyra had fallen gravely ill with a swift-moving fever. "I could not save her," Silas whispered, the pain still fresh in his voice. "And after she was gone, people came to me. They came for the carvings I made, but their eyes held only pity. They saw not my work, but a broken man. They kept telling me how sorry they were, but every time they spoke her name, every time they looked at me with that gentle, sorrowful gaze, I saw only my failure to keep her well. I could not bear the noise of their sympathy. It felt like a condemnation." He fled, leaving everything behind, seeking a place where no one knew his name, a place where he could exist only as a pair of hands that still remembered how to shape wood. He explained the melodies, the soft music she had heard. "I would play the flute I brought with me. It was the only sound that drowned out the echoes in my own head. I played the songs she loved." This confirmed the clue she heard in the first section. The strange or unexpected detail of his confession was that he had not merely retreated from grief, but from sympathy, a burden of kindness he found heavier than solitude itself. The discovery of his hidden shelter was accidental, he explained, but the finding of the journal was not. "He saw you that day, at the mill. I saw the kindness in your eyes, the lack of judgment. I moved the journal, hoping you would find the alcove and understand." This moment of truth fully answered the mysterious question Elara had pondered. The journal was an intentional bridge, his silent plea for understanding. He now looked directly at her, his expression a mixture of profound relief and raw fear. "I didn't think anyone would care enough to find me."
Silas's confession, raw and deeply personal, hung in the air of the mill, transforming the space from a place of mystery into a sanctuary of shared grief. Elara knew the moment was critical, his truth was fragile, and he could easily retreat back into the comfortable silence of the woods. She placed her empty mug beside his, a simple, nonverbal affirmation of their equality in that moment. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but steady, "the sorrow you feel for Lyra is a profound love, but hiding it here does not lessen it. It only lessens you. The silence of the wood is beautiful, but it cannot speak back to you." She paused, allowing him to absorb her words. "Your art, the bird, the rose, it carries a life and a feeling that the village needs. Your craft is not a failure, it is a memory, a living testament to the love you shared. When people look upon a thing of such beauty, they will see the skill, and they will feel the emotion of the creator. They won't see your failure, they will see your enduring strength." This was the memorable emotional moment, a direct, heartfelt challenge to his self-imposed condemnation. She then presented him with a simple, practical proposal. The old manor house near the church has a small carriage house that has sat empty for years. It has good light and a strong workbench. The air is quiet there, quieter than the noise of the main street. I think you could find a new silence there, one that is shared, not imposed. Silas remained silent for a long time, turning his wooden mug over and over in his hands. He was fighting the ingrained habit of self-preservation through isolation. He looked at the shadows, then at Elara's kind, patient face, and finally, he gave a slow, minute nod. He did not speak again that night, but the agreement was made, sealed by a shared understanding of a happy ending that was only now beginning to be sketched out. The following morning, the strange or unexpected detail was the ease of his departure. He did not look back at the mill. He simply collected his most precious belongings, his carving tools, his flute, and a bundle of carefully selected wood, and walked with Elara toward the village. They walked in the early light, the Blackwood Forest silent behind them, no longer a refuge, but a past chapter. Elara introduced him quietly to the village elder, explaining only that he was a distant relation who had come to settle and needed a place to work, emphasizing his need for quietude.
The carriage house was prepared, and Silas began to work. His presence was not a sudden spectacle, it was a slow, quiet integration. He would work for hours in the sunlit space, and the village children, drawn by the faint sound of his chisels and the scent of fresh wood, would often gather to watch the lost artisan transform blocks of timber into creatures of grace and wonder. He never spoke much, but he would often carve small, smooth pieces of wood for them, each one a tiny, perfect gift. The villagers learned to respect his silence, offering quiet greetings and leaving small gifts of food by his door, never demanding conversation or expressing overt pity. Silas, surrounded by the quiet hum of life, slowly began to heal. He started teaching a young apprentice the art of the flute, and the melodies that were once only heard in the deep forest now drifted full of gentle hope across the quiet lawns of Oakhaven. His art flourished, finding a new purpose in the warmth of community. But would his integration into the village genuinely cure his fear of judgment, or would the next difficulty send him back to the silent forest? The happiness was found not in forgetting his sorrow, but in sharing the beautiful creation it had inspired. The long shadows of the evening now stretch across the cottage, and the scent of cedar and pine that clung to Elara's clothes has faded, replaced by the sweeter aroma of wood smoke from many hearths. The mill stands empty now, a quiet relic of a hidden past, visited only by the forest creatures. Silas, no longer the solitary shadow, is sitting by his workbench in the carriage house. The window is open, and the gentle, reedy notes of his flute, a song of contentment, not sorrow, drift lazily on the cooling air. He is carving not for himself, but for the life around him, his hands moving with the easy rhythm of a man finally at peace with his past. He is surrounded not by the oppressive silence of the wild, but by the soft, comforting noise of people who have learned that love and healing are often found in quiet acceptance, not in loud sympathy. His greatest piece of art is not the carved rose, as beautiful as it is, but the life he has rebuilt, piece by gentle piece. Elara often brings him tea, sitting in silence while he works, their connection a quiet, enduring strength that needs no explanation. The forest remains, dark and vast, but its edges are no longer sharp with mystery. They are softened by the sound of music and the knowledge that every soul, no matter how lost, can find its way home through the simple, persistent kindness of another. The silence that once held his pain now holds his hope. The end of the story. Sweet dreams.